Well, he saved a lot of ships from oblivion, ships that there are no other illustrations of. So his contribution to the future is really, you really can't measure it in terms of anyone trying to get an illustration of a ship at a specific period in time.
His heart was just as big as the rest of them. I mean, you couldn't get your arms around him. He just filled the room up between his body and his personality. He was just everything.
I think the most important thing is his preservation, wanting to be part of the preservation of the history of, our sailing vessels. When I acquired this collection, I wasn't really sure what I had embarked upon. All I knew is I had a lot of big containers and a lot of piles that I had to weed through.
He knew exactly where everything was. If he was working on a particular boat, all of his reference stuff was handy. His desk, of course, was quite high, but it was covered with stuff. And he had things stacked on it quite tall. And then the whole wall was all reference books, engineering books. He had a lot of maps. To me, it was a disaster.
What I always saw was the lighting in his studio was inadequate, fine during the day, but he would work late into the night. And it was always pretty dimly lit at night.
And somehow or another, he had space in the middle and all this other stuff around him.
But he had the blueprints. He had the original drawings from different sources, which are a gold mine of information. Blueprints, most of them are gone. Unless it belonged to a museum, most of them have just not withstood the test of time and have kind of crumbled away. So a lot of those early blueprints no longer exist.
He just accomplished so much. He just did it.
So Frank Crevier was a local. He was born in Marine City.
He was a civil engineer with the Corps of Engineers.
So he was involved with a lot of the projects that went on around the Great Lakes, and he knew everything about them, and he liked to talk about them.
Wherever Frank went, he just walked in the door and people, they knew him, or if they didn't know him, they welcomed him.
He was friendly, and he was the kind of guy that would put his arm around you. Just a pretty nice guy.
His hair was always, yeah, he liked to wear like those polo shirts or golf shirts. It always had a sea logo of some kind, anchors or whatever.
He was a big, imposing guy, and to see this kind of delicate detail come out of someone that size, it's amazing.
He wanted to paint, he wanted to draw, and he always had a passion for the river. But he didn't have the talent for the painting part of it. He only did 1 or 2 actual paintings of boats, but he wasn't happy with them because the boat wasn't right, the ship wasn't right. He didn't like them, and they did not show his talent. With this engineering thing, it was always lines and correctness and measurements. He thought that was what his passion would be.
Detail is what it's all about when you're doing a ship. Any sort of marine illustration, it can be a great painting. Every line has to be exact, or it isn't that ship. In his case, it's a side view, and sometimes that's even worse because every single line has to be perfect.
It's a 2-dimensional image, but it's right there. It gives you exactly what it looked like and how it looked back in the day.
His images are accurate to the point where they're an exact representation of the ship. It's just like the ship shrunk in miniature, not just an illustration of a ship.
When he looked straight at you, the center was like a black ball of nothing, and he saw around it. That was when I found out he really couldn't see real well. He had glasses, yes, but to spend hours and hours and hours of lining these things in, that made it harder for him to be so exact, and I think that's why it took him so long. The real intricate ones, he was forever.
Every piece that he did, he was thorough in representing it on paper, so he was well versed in doing that, especially with his engineering background.
His incredible talent for detail. That's really the first thing I think about when I think of Frank Crevier, which is something I always have appreciated. I try to reflect it in my work too, was the amount of time and effort he was willing to lavish on something that to a lot of people would not seem that important.
He did not flaunt his ability. In some ways he was very quiet and modest. It took me a couple years to realize how important he was, because he didn't bother telling you that.
Usually they were drawn perfectly the first time.
He was concerned with making sure the boat was correct. With Frank's pictures, the whole story is the boat. Someone built this boat, worked on it, someone knew all the measurements and how to make it work, and he was going to honor that. And he did a beautiful job with that part. There's a whole story that goes with it.
Every piece that he set out to draw and to color, he did thorough history on. So I have file cabinets and boxes full of all of his research material, original black and white pictures, drawings. In addition to that, a lot of these prints come with a 3-page description of each ship. That was his way, I believe, in helping with that preservation, because he passes on that information onto the next person.
He never did one that he didn't do a complete history on. That's why his desk looked like it did. I mean, he had all this reference material, and he made sure that he had everything in place.
I was just always astounded at how willing he was to share what he had. In those days, you just didn't sit at a computer or a keypad and get information about different ships and where they were built. You usually had to go to the source. He was more than willing to share what he had with someone like myself that was, new to him and new to the marine art. I've tried to be that way myself with people that are looking for information or even just starting out in painting. I've always tried to be more than helpful with them. And that's probably because of the way he treated me.
Frank Crevier's purpose in doing the delineations and putting this collection together and drawing these was to preserve the history of the vessels that sailed on the Great Lakes. Anywhere from schooners to side paddle to, freighters. It's just amazing.
I kind of think he realized that it was disappearing and that his generation would be the last ones to really experience the way it was at what we call now the golden age. Literally hundreds of ships on the lakes carrying every commodity you could think of. They were employing thousands and thousands of people, and that was fast disappearing. I think he may have felt a certain sense of urgency to put down on paper some of the things that he knew that once his generation was gone would no longer be available. Now I'm beginning to feel a little bit the same way myself, so I can understand it.
So in order to preserve these pieces, I have teamed up with a wonderful framer up in St. Clair, Brush and Palette. His name's Jim.
That goes on like that, and then you just put a piece of glass on, and then the finished product is similar to that. Altogether, it probably takes me between an hour and a half and 2 hours for each piece, so it's not something you do in 5 minutes. So far I've done probably about 100 pieces, and each one of these are really great looking boats. Frank was a very talented person as far as putting colors together. Everything we have here in this collection is hand colored, hand painted, signed. In fact, they're not even numbered because they're all originals.
30 of them were already framed, so we preserved the frames that they were in and reinforced them, whatever we needed to do. But each of his works now are preserved, and that makes me happy.
Oh, I'm just happy that you're doing this. This is an honor for him. He deserves this.
That's exactly
He
what I
deserves
thought.
this.
Part of the collection, we were lucky enough to have 7 of the original works of ships that were built in Marine City. So we have originals of the Huron and the Alpina and the Pearl and a few others. So I was excited. I had hoped that there were going to be more, but I'm really happy with the 7 that I have, and I really cherish those because they are near and dear to the Marine City heart and our history.
At the time he was putting his files together, he was losing interest with a lot of people. Most of that generation, like from the turn of the century, from the 1900s, were dying out, and their children had no interest in a lot of that material. And a lot of it was just being thrown out. Well, Frank, because of his nature and because of what he did, had access to a lot of those families. And he went around and saved a lot of this material that would have been long gone. All that information was there. He just had the foresight to start getting it and putting it together and putting it in a central area where he could have access to it. Well, obviously, if anybody that's looked at his work comments on the detail and the accuracy And if he didn't have those files or that information that he had, you would not see that in his renderings or his illustrations. And that is what set him apart from everyone else. Everyone else was working from either photographs or descriptions. He had the actual original builder's plans. He had the enrollment papers, everything you would really need to have a really accurate representation of that particular ship at that particular time. Like I said before, on a ship, every line has to be exact or it isn't that ship. That's one way to look at his work. His legacy is that he's saved a lot of ships that we would no longer know what they looked like. By doing a side view profile, he saved the illustration of the ship. And that's what impresses me about his work.